And welcome to week 7. This is our penultimate week together. And this week we're going to look at the Renaissance and the High Middle Ages. Well, actually, the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance in chronological order. This week is really very special because we also get into some of the preconceived notions that a lot of people have about the medieval period, often during the Renaissance and later during the Enlightenment. Uh, the medieval period was looked back upon as the Dark Ages. In fact, you could even still call it the Dark Ages in some books and some analyses. But I think that's incredibly unfair. And we're going to get to why that is unfair in just a moment here. Let's start off with terms. Renaissance is a French word for rebirth, and it is coined during this late medieval period as a reflection of the refocusing of European ideals and aesthetics and learning that harkens back to the classical period, the Greeks and the Romans. This is in part because of the emergence of what we will call the middling class. In the medieval period, there is a very hierarchical structure. And yes, it's entirely possible to become affluent, which these families do. And it is in order to display this affluence and to display this influence that these families have that you get the sponsorship of the Renaissance. I'm talking about the Medicis, right? This family of merchants turned bankers turned uncrowned princes. They become popes. They wield a lot of influence. The Borgias is another good example of this. The family was a set of middling merchants. They really made money during the Crusades, shipping people to their doom over in the Middle East, and that's where they made their money. And then from there they parlay this into banking. And if you owe somebody some money, and if they ask you a favor, often you give them that favor, and that allows them to accrue more and more power. Now, why are they called a middling sort? Well, they're not nobility. None of them are nobility. Although, excuse me, although eventually the uh, the Borgias and the other middling sorts do acquire these kind of titles. It's only later. They're not born into the nobility. But they're also not peasants. They're not just mere artisans. They have way too much money, way too much influence, way too much power. So they're the middling sort. And in a way, they kind of draw a parallel to the middle class that eventually emerges during the Industrial Revolution. Philosophy. Philosophy we've kind of dealt with. Philosophy, in the classical sense, had a lot of different fields of interest. Philosophy could also encompass things that we would recognize as physics or as um, intellectual theories on the workings of the universe. The atomists, for example, who believed that the world or the universe was created by small infinitesimal pieces that are all essentially the same, just slightly different waverings that comprise the entire universe. That they were philosophers. They had no idea what they were talking about. They had no way to prove what they were talking about. But it turns out that they were correct. So they would be physicists, really, in a modern sense. Philosophy begins to divorce itself during this Renaissance period, and you get the emergence of so-called hard sciences, things like physics, like I mentioned before, versus esoteric debates, the nature of life, why are we here, what is morality, that sort of thing. And although it doesn't completely divorce, it's a split that starts during the Renaissance that continues well into the Enlightenment period. And by the time you get to our period here in the 21st century, if you said you were into philosophy, you the assumption would be you're wearing a tweed jacket and you're talking about Kant and Rousseau, and maybe uh, you're debating whether it's moral to do A or B versus will this ball drop the same speed as another ball, right? Divine right. It is well, we'll call it a philosophy during the medieval period that essentially explains why kings and why those in power are in power. And that is that God basically gives them blessing to rule. And how do we know God gives them blessing to rule? Well, it's that close relationship that was established in the early medieval period with the church, with the Catholic Church. And by the time we get to about the 1450s, the Catholic Church really is kind of the authority. Now, there are a lot of problems with that authority, and there are a lot of challenges to that authority, and there are attempts to reform the Catholic Church in this kind of corrupting influence of that close relationship with power, but it hasn't happened yet. And then finally, we have the Magna Carta. And this is an important document for our purposes, but not really in the time that it was signed. The Magna Carta is this great charter. That's literally what it means, the Great Charter. It's an English document that comes from the 12th, well, 13th century. That essentially is the first codification in Europe of the limits upon divine right, upon the rights of kings. Now, is it a perfect document? No. Does it apply to everybody? No. Is it enforced evenly throughout the English history? No. But it does form the basis of what would later become jurisprudence, the Anglo-American style jurisprudence, the idea of charging a person before, if you're going to hold them, you have to charge them within a certain period of time. They have the right to confront their witnesses arrayed against them. They have the right to hear the charges. They have the right to a speedy trial, that sort of thing. That is all founded over 800 years ago. So it's a very important thing, and it should be noted, it happens during the late medieval period. So is it a Dark Ages? I don't think so. Now, there are some things that you need to forget. A lot of people come into a course or maybe even the week on medieval history thinking they know everything. There's knights running around with heavy armor, and they're hitting each other with swords, and they're saving fair maidens, and there's castles and courtly love and all this blah 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 stuff, right? There's some other things that also come kind of packed in there. Is this idea that Europe was a dominant force. It really wasn't. Europeans are relatively weak compared to, say, empires in the Middle East. At the same time that the Renaissance is happening in Europe, and there's a lot of internecine warfare, and there's some scrabbling about for power, the Ottoman Empire is enjoying its golden age. There's the Mughal Sultanate in Delhi. There's the dynasties in China that are incredibly wealthy. Even West Africa at this time, about this time, it has way more wealth and way more access to the world than Europeans do. They're also politically fragmented, Europeans are. So we've got to forget this idea that Western Europe is like this engine of change, even though right now we're going to be spending a week talking about them and reading about them. We also have to forget this idea of inevitability. It is an argument in legal terms, post hoc ergo propter hoc. What is taking place now assumes that it is always going to happen. That's a logical fallacy. This idea that Europe will become a dominant partner on the global stage is not taken for granted at all. In fact, most of the time when Europeans meet other cultures, they have to act subserviently. For example, if immigrants from England had landed in North America and said to all the Native Americans, hey, we're Western Europeans. You guys are weak and useless. Give us your land. We're going to rape your women, that sort of thing. There would have not been a northern North American colony. There would not have been. A good example of this would be Roanoke. Roanoke literally disappeared as a settlement. One minute they were there, next minute they were gone. So we have to really take this concept of inevitability away from studying the medieval period. And also, hand in hand with that, this idea of like a manifest destiny or God's blessing, or God was behind Christians, or God was behind Western Europe expanding and spreading His word and spreading civilization. That is an incredibly, well, racist ideology. It is grounded in, and a lot of that argumentation is grounded in the very philosophies that eventually give the Nazi regime a kind of a boost. And also, it's an incredibly paternalistic and narrow-sighted way to interpret history. That's as if to say that all the atrocities that happen, the massacres that happen, they were all part of God's plan. That is not true. That is human action. Because once you say another power, whether it is God, it's aliens, it's the Illuminati, whatever, is making these things happen, you take away the responsibility for your actions. So, for instance, if you go out and rob a bank, you're responsible for your actions. You decided to go and rob a bank. Similarly, countries decide that they are going to go to war. They're going to go to war over opium. They want to spread opium. They want to sell opium. Is it God's plan to have people addicted to narcotics? Probably not. Is it a human plan? Most likely. So, we got to get that out of our head. Divine guidance does not exist. It does not, because then we're not makers of history. We are merely pawns in a vast cosmic game, and therefore we have no free will, and therefore if we sin, it's not our fault. Boom. There you go. All right, so divine right is the church basically explains that the king is in power because God says the king is in power. And to obey God, you have to obey his temporal powers. You obey the king, sometimes the queen, who is set in charge of you. And this is kind of a mimicking of the kind of biblical hierarchy of God and angels and humans. That essentially you have God who's in heaven, and he has his angels who are administering it, which would be the church. And then, of course, you have humans who must only ever worship God. That's all you ever do, period. That's all you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to do anything else. You do what God tells you to do, and God tells you, worship me, right? Same thing with the God. Same thing with king or queen. A king might say, hey, all you do is work that field. That's all you're ever going to do. And this is a feudal system, a military feudal system, which is really kind of a very dangerous term because all the concepts we have about feudal society never really manifest in Europe altogether in any one place. But there are bits and pieces that kind of seem similar to feudalism. So essentially you have this kind of hierarchy. Peasants and serfs and artisans basically obey. The aristocrats tell you what to do, and the king essentially keeps the aristocrats in check. That's how it's supposed to work. And that it is a overlapping obligations, that the king doesn't get to just enjoy all the power and everybody doing what he tells them to do. The king is also supposed to protect the nation or protect the kingdom, to ensure that if there's a famine, that the serfs don't starve. It's just kind of common sense. If there's hunger out there, make sure they don't starve, right? Some kings do this better than others. Some kings are total jerks. Some are not. And it really just depends. I mean, it's very kind of when you have an inherited position like that, your talent pool is going to be very spotty. So, the king looks after the peasants. The king also looks after the aristocrats, but he also asks of the aristocrats a lot of things. So aristocrats like barons and dukes and counts and that sort of thing, they're in charge of their little area, and that is given to them by the king. It may be over generations. It may have been hundreds of years ago. The king basically holds the authority to take away the right to rule that land in his stead. In order to prevent that, of course, the aristocrat levies troops. They hire mercenaries. They train knights. They do whatever in order for the king to be able to go to war. Now, does this work perfectly? No, not at all. And there are, of course, exceptions to the rule. One of the exceptions is the Magna Carta pictured here. In the early 13th century, a group of aristocrats turned the tables upon the king. See, that's why we say that the feudal system is very kind of like spotty and doesn't really apply everywhere all the time, and is very imperfect. The brother of King Richard, Prince John, who was ruling as regent of England, had been forced to sign a document regarding the boundaries that kings had, what they could and could not do. For example, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled, nor will we proceed with force against him except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay the right of justice. Um, this is applying only to wealthy aristocrats. A free man is a nobility or somebody who has a little bit of power. So if you were a serf, if you were tied to the land, you are not free. You cannot leave. So this did not apply to you at first. Over time, however, it does begin to apply to peasantry, and especially to serfs. Well, how does that happen? Well, it takes a special kind of invasion to shake up the European status quo. And real life serfs were exploited throughout most of the medieval period in Europe in general. Being a serf generally was not fun. It was not a great life. That being said, some serfs actually led better lives than most working class Americans do today. For example, more days off. Many serfs had way more days off. There was also ample food security. You didn't have to worry about starving too much because a lot of the wheat or the barley or whatever that you gave in taxes went into the royal granary. And if there was starvation, if there was hunger in the entire county or maybe the entire country, the king would dole out this grain. He would give out bread to keep people alive. But that being said, being a serf was not ideal. If you time traveled, you probably didn't want to become a serf. But there's this new invader that comes in from Asia in the 14th century, and it disrupts European society. The European military response is completely ineffective. There is no way you can conduct diplomacy. Prayers to God are unanswered, and eventually people come to the conclusion that this is obviously punishment by God for the sins of Europeans. We've done something horrible. And so God has sent a quite literal biblical plague upon us. And that's the Black Plague. Between 1347 and 1349, the worst Black Plague, what is officially recognized as the worst plague to ever hit Europe. Not the first, not the last, but it is definitely the worst. It sweeps along trade routes and it originated in China. It was part of that biological warfare that the Mongols like to engage in to weaken a city. This plague progresses along trade routes with people fleeing from the cities, and of course they're taking the disease with them, much like when you get the flu. Maybe it'd take a couple of days before it starts manifesting, but you're incubating in that whole time, and then you spread the plague. There used to be a theory that it was borne by fleas on rats, and that they would jump off and they would bite people and infect them. New models seem to suggest that it was actually kind of an airborne plague, um, and that actually the infestation through vermin is probably not as efficient. You want to know what's even less efficient spreading a disease? Biting. Biting is really, really inefficient. I mean, just really horribly inefficient. So zombie plague, people getting bit. No, I'm sorry. That just does not. No, that doesn't work. Airborne, that is really, really dangerous. In fact, it's so dangerous. Within 2 years, estimates vary depending on where you are. Some of the more remote regions only lose about a third of their population. Some of the more densely packed areas of Europe, you lose 50% or more. So imagine in your life, think about your immediate family, and imagine half of that immediate family dead from a plague that you can't stop. You have no idea where it came from. It is ravaging rich, poor, healthy, sick, young, old, pious, unpious alike, criminals all the way up to kings. This leads to a lot of myth and superstition. For example, there's the myth that cats are the cause of the plague. In fact, the poor cats, they really get the short end of the stick whenever it comes to human superstition. Part of this is because of the association of cats with the goddess Circe, the goddess of magic. And magic, of course, is heresy in the Catholic Church. This is devil worship. It is a pact you make with the devil to subvert God's will, to cast spells or whatever like that. So therefore, if you have a cat, you are a witch. If you are a witch, you consort with the devil. Therefore, cats are equal to devil worship. They also have some other mythologies, like God is punishing us for not being grateful enough for what he has given us. And so some villages, especially in France, enforced laughter, enforced cheeriness was the call of the day, as if laughter could keep the disease at bay. And then, of course, we also have little reminders of how virulent this plague is. When your kids sing, or maybe when you were a child, you may have sung Ring Around the Rosie. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, right? Well, Ring Around the Rosie is you would wear your rosary around your neck, and you would get bruises around your neck because one of the plagues would cause welts and boils along soft tissue, and that your neck is very soft. So you have a ring around the rosy, and then you would have a pocket full of posies because this is the emergent miasmic theory, the idea that foul air caused disease just in and of itself. So if something smelled bad, it was going to make you sick. Conversely, if something smelled good, it would keep you healthy. And that was the idea. So you would keep a pocket full of posies, a pocket full of flowers to press to your mouth and your nose so you could breathe sweet air as if it were filtering it. So Ring Around the Rosie, a pocket full of posies. It's not ashes, ashes. It's achoo, achoo. You would start sneezing. And that's how it started. And we all fall down. We all die. So that's a little macabre, isn't it? Children's rhymes you'll find, and children's stories in general, are really kind of very macabre. To be fair, they started off as stories for peasant people and eventually became children's stories. So this also influences art as well. And you see in some of these depictions, we have a lot of skeletons, although not anatomically correct. So if you're a biology major, please forgive these people. They really didn't know how the human body was structured, and so they're doing their best guesses, right? So you would have, the middling sort. Of course, he'd be taken away by the plague, but what about this royal-born lady? She's so fair and kind and pious and loves God. And what about the king? Why is he being taken away? And if this was a punishment against the wicked, why is the child being taken away? Well, there is a silver lining, and this, if you watch The Walking Dead, here, let me give you a silver lining. The plague eventually goes away. It eventually subsides. People become they become resistant to the plague. Europeans become very, very resistant to the plague. The old axiom, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is kind of true for your immune system. It's the whole premise behind vaccination. It doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, it makes you more resistant to that disease. So eventually the plague subsides. It does come back in later generations when you have a new crop of humans that are being born who haven't been exposed to the plague, and it does kill, but not quite as devastatingly. Post-plague Europe is a great time to be a serf. Now it is time you want to time travel because you can demand higher wages. There is labor that needs to be done. It's a very labor-intensive society. There are no machines to do anything. So everything from harvesting grain to making clothing to brewing beer, all of it needs to be done by hand. Everything is done by hand. So serfs can demand higher wages, that they get more time off, that they get less taxes, that they get more wages, whatever. If they don't like what happens to them, they can up and leave. They just move to another. They move to another location. They abandon their land, and who's going to come after them? Well, just as devastated are the lords and ladies. There aren't as many soldiers running around. So you can go to a town, you can take up a trade, you can change your name, and this leads to increased wages. And these increased wages leads to people living better. And the aristocracy that survives is kind of upset at this. Throughout Europe, you have a very clear delineation of status that you can assess right at a glance. You can look at somebody and go, okay, that's a noble. Okay, that's a king. Partly because of, well, the level of cleanliness that they would have, but also partly because of the clothing that they wore. It was a large part. So they would wear expensive fabrics. They would wear very expensive dyes. They would wear very fancy shoes. Well, what happens when working class people start getting paid better wages? Well, they start living better. They start spending more. And that's a key economic thing. Is in the Renaissance, economics does dictate this change in attitude towards philosophy and towards religion and towards art. And that is partly because there is more money in the economy being spent by working class and middle class people. They're buying things. They're stimulating the economy. Typically, historically, economically, rich people tended to sit on their money. They tend to accumulate more money, or they use their money to make more money. For instance, interest, banking, that sort of thing. It doesn't actually go into the economy. It doesn't actually make anything really happen, not comparatively, on a pound for pound basis. A pound of gold sitting in a bank versus a pound of gold being spent by a bunch of peasants. A pound of gold spent by a bunch of peasants usually recoups way more, creates way more economic advantage. Serfs who remain behind become more and more autonomous. They become self-governing. You get the emergence of this group of people called reeves. And I'm using an English term here. There's a bunch of different terms here throughout Europe. But a reeve is essentially somebody who administers land on the behalf of the lord or lady. And they become legal experts. And this is where the uh, Magna Carta begins to kind of percolate further and further down into the lower strata of society and forms the basis of English jurisprudence, which then eventually becomes American jurisprudence, so that people begin to know that, hey, you can't hold on to me according to this legal precedent. You can't hold me for an indeterminate period of time. Now, does this work perfectly? No, not really, but you start seeing changes here. So why Renaissance? If the medieval period was doing fairly well, why Renaissance? Why rebirth? Well, it is a loaded term. It is a term that really is pejorative to say that there was this period where we were stagnating. Not really, but comparatively, it's a much better time to be alive in the Renaissance than it is in the medieval period. Um, there's a refocusing upon human learning and understanding using logic and reason rather than dogma and religious dictum to understand the natural world. There's also alterations of artistic styles and the rise of new forms or maybe rediscovered forms of government. A good example of this would be the Florentine Republic and reemergence of res publica as opposed to this kind of monarchical system. And finally, a flourishing of scientific investigation. And it all kicks off in the Italian city-states. Now, the Italian peninsula itself is really divided. It has a bunch of very powerful city-states that are the major engines of their political struggles, their economic struggles, and their cultural um, reimaginings. Genoa, Pisa, Venice, Florence, and Milan. Florence really kind of kicks it off. This is where the Medicis are. The Medicis are arguably the wealthiest family in Italy, if not the wealthiest family in Europe. They've been making loans to kings, kings of France, kings of England, kings of the German states. So they got some powerful friends, right? And they're made wealthy by trade and shipping along and within the Mediterranean. The Crusades made these city-states very wealthy. They provided the ships and the transportation to the Holy Land that a lot of the Crusaders needed in order to be able to go fight the Muslims. So whenever one group is fighting another, you can guarantee somebody is making money somewhere along the line. And then by the late 14th and early 15th century, the Italian city-states have this kind of monopoly on trade with the Ottoman and Arab lands. And it really solidifies in the mid 15th century when the last vestiges of the Roman Empire fall, the Byzantine Empire falls. Um, Now the Italians have this kind of lock. They are the monopoly. They are the only source of things like silk, of sugar, nutmeg, rice, mace, peppercorns, you name it. Anything that you can see as a potential luxury in the medieval period, the Italians are probably have their hands in it in some way. And so it's this flow of wealth, especially into these uh, middling sorts hands, that leads to the Renaissance. Because like uh, like the kings of old, these merchant princes, we'll call them, these merchant princes want to flaunt their wealth. Whereas today you would have maybe a reality TV show and you would show off your house in the Hollywood Hills and you would have, you know, 14 different Ferraris or whatever like that. The same way they show off their wealth. And how they do that is by sponsoring artists, sponsoring architects, sponsoring public works, creating massive cathedrals, creating these breathtaking and mind-bogglingly complex works of art at their own expense. Did they get anything for it? Did they get any money back from that? No, they don't. But it increases their prestige. It increases their public cachet. Let me talk about some of the art. Medieval art is often very kind of ad hoc. It doesn't have any system of rules, and it's not that people aren't talented in their representations. I'm sure a lot of the talent that they have is very natural, but you also, in addition to talent, you have to have some kind of training. You could be a very talented guitar player or a very talented saxophone player. Um, you have the talent there, but if you don't have the training and don't understand how keys change or how things happen, how you make these sounds and these transitions, you're going to be kind of hit and miss. And that's the same thing with medieval art. It tended to be very flat. It doesn't have really a unified perspective. For example, what's with this person? Is this a child? Is this a person standing in the background? What about these guys? Are they stacked like cordwood, one on top of the other? Do they make sure that the very tall people in the back and the very short people in front? It seems like they're just kind of like piled there. Like I'm just going to group a bunch of people here and just kind of leave them there. And then what direction is this book facing? It's not facing the people who are singing. It's not facing the people who are directing. Who is it facing? I mean, what could they possibly be doing? So this lacks a certain something, doesn't it? And can you tell where the walls are? And what about those doors? Aren't those doors kind of weird looking? Would you know that there are three walls here? No, you don't really. Okay, and this is a mid 15th century painting, right? Check out 60 years later. And this is The School of Athens by Raphael. Now, where the last painting showed a church setting, which was very typical of medieval art, it was always church-centric, somehow worshiping God, giving praise to God, because God gave you this talent to paint, this eye for color, so the only worthy expression of it is to worship God, to praise God. That's the only reason God gave you that, because God is a massive narcissist, right? So Renaissance art, however, gives you a completely different feel. First off, we've got people in the background who are slightly smaller, but we get that sense of depth, don't we? I mean, look at this gallery we've got going on here. It seems to disappear into the horizon, doesn't it? But it looks natural, like as if you were standing here. Oh, that's exactly how I would recognize it. You also have people who are dressed in classical era robes. They're wearing helmets from the Greek period. They're wearing robes from the classical Roman and Greek period. They're also wearing some other clothing, and I'll point these out in just a minute here. You also have um, Greco-Roman gods depicted. And so this would be on the right is Athena, patron goddess of Athens. And on the left you have, gosh, his name escaped me, Apollo. There we are. So you have Apollo on the left, who's like this muse of music and artistry, right? Or this god of music and artistry. But you also have some hidden things here, and this is one of the things that is a common thread in Renaissance art. Is you get this kind of nod to people who are famous through depicting them as people who are contemporary to you. So we have, for instance, we have this could be Euclid or maybe Pythagoras, right? So he's giving a class right there in Athens. Now, did Euclid or Pythagoras live in Athens and teach at Athens school? No, no, they didn't, right? The other one we might want to look at is this guy over here. He's wearing a turban. Now, a turban seems to indicate he is Muslim, or he is Arab at the very least. Would an Arab have found himself participating in a school at Athens in the 5th century BCE? No. Probably not. Probably not. Very unlikely. So the the people that are depicted though are famous people. So we have Euclid on the right, and on the left we have Ibn Rushd, Averroes. He's a Spanish Muslim philosopher, mathematician, scientist who is incredibly influential in the Renaissance. So he's included in this classical era of learned men. We also have right there in the back, see that helmet there? That's Alexander the Great. Would Alexander the Great have attended class with Socrates, who's in the green robe immediately to his to our right from that circle? That green robe, that's Socrates. The man in the center, of course, is Plato, and Plato is actually depicted as, anybody want to take a guess, uh, a famous Renaissance artist and polymath? Leonardo da Vinci. So Raphael depicted Plato as Leonardo da Vinci. He also depicted Michelangelo there as an architect. It might be Vitruvius, who is an architect in the classical period, who gave this idea the idea of ideal proportions, that in order to hang an arch or in order to build any kind of building, you have to have these ideal proportions, that the weight of something is dispersed correctly so that it doesn't collapse in amongst itself. It's also aesthetically pleasing, and it would actually go on to influence one of the more iconic treatises on human anatomy, The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. Pictured on the right, Vitruvian Man. Before the systematic and scientific analysis of human proportions, it was really up to people to kind of guess at how you would draw a hand. It might not really look right, but you got the gist of it, as we saw in that first painting, where hands didn't look anything more than like kind of flippers with lines in them, basically, or that arms bent at unnatural angles. They seemed more sweeping and kind of circular than they were angular, right? So Antonio Paolulo was the first Renaissance artist really given permission by the church to dissect human bodies, and that was in the 1460s. Up until this time, doing any kind of dissection, even to executed criminals or people who had already been dead, was considered blasphemy. It was desecration of corpses, which would explain why some of the depictions of skeletons in the prior works that we talked about were really kind of really weird and didn't even really look human. So dissecting bodies was considered a taboo that was broken in the 1460s in the first time. Da Vinci also participated in some of these dissections, and it is during these dissections that he kept very detailed, very technical schematics of how the human body was put together. And you have the Vitruvian Man that was depicted here. Vitruvian Man is named after that Roman architect that I mentioned before, Vitruvius. The idea of ideal proportions for buildings also applies to human bodies. For instance, in a correctly or a ideally formed human body, arms are the same length, legs are the same length. So if you were to put your hands out, you don't have, like, say, a left arm is 5 inches longer than your right arm, or your left leg is 2 inches shorter than your right leg. That just doesn't happen. In fact, there's also ideal proportions, your symmetry of your body. Your right side of your face looks similar to the left side of your face, that sort of thing. Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and others also pioneered using architectural terms to describe medical processes or the structures they found within the human body. For example, there's the zygomatic process. The zygomatic arch is a part of your face, and it is a zygomatic, and they refer to it as an arch, much like you would in a building, because of its purpose as well as its shape. So things like that. Another example would be the heart, the chambers of the heart. You have the atrium. An atrium is kind of an entry port to a building. So you have the right atrium and the left atrium, right? So you have these dissections, which are published, become the standard medical techniques or standard medical textbooks for centuries. They go on to inform the doctors who attempt to treat George Washington in the early 1800s when he was sick with pneumonia. They're pulling on textbooks from 400 years prior or 350 years prior. At the same time that Europe is experiencing this renaissance, and I mentioned before that the Byzantine Empire begins to kind of crumble and fall. And in 1453, actually, is when Constantinople begins to fall. The Ottoman Empire had long been kind of extorting money from this basically city-state now. It was no longer an empire. Anything beyond a few hundred yards from the walls of Constantinople, what is now known as Istanbul, anything beyond a few hundred yards of the walls of Constantinople was not Byzantine territory anymore. They were mostly a puppet state. They were left in place because they paid a lot of money to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire finally got sick of it, decided, you know what, it's time to finally conquer this city, and they do in 1453. And they put an end to this sickly, weak, lack of a better term, empire. When they conquer Constantinople, one of the side effects is that a lot of Jews and Christians flee from the Constantinople, and they find refuge in the Italian city-states because, well, it just so happens that they're going there. They have financial ties, and so a lot of that learning from that time, from the classical period, a lot of learning that was kept locked away and inaccessible to Europeans begins to flood into Europe. So, for example, Aristotle was known as one of the classical philosophers of the Greco-Roman period. But at the time in the 1400s, almost nobody had ever heard of Socrates, and very few had heard of Plato. So having these Socratic learnings, for instance, suddenly thrust upon Europe flourishes this kind of, ooh, that's interesting. Let's comment upon this and let's see if this matches with what we've learned with these other philosophers like Aristotle and Ptolemy. At the same time, there is a battle going on in Spain because, as I mentioned several weeks back, the Muslim conquerors had crossed into Iberia and they were holding Spain. And I mentioned with Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes, the adversary, that Muslims had a very nice, strong foothold in Spain. Well, between the 7th century AD and the 15th century AD, there was this kind of on-again, off-again war between Christians and Muslims, actually Christian kings and Muslim sultanates, to push the Muslims out. And by the time we get to about 1490, 1493-ish, the last of the Reconquista, or the reconquering, crushes the final caliphate in Cordoba and pushes out a lot of Muslims who then also flee to Constantinople and to Morocco and to places in the Middle East. You also get a lot of Jews who are fleeing Spain because of the Spanish Inquisition. And so you have this kind of environment now where you have this mutual antagonism between Christians in Europe against Muslims and Muslims in the Middle East against Christians. To give you an idea how big the Ottoman Empire gets, and it really is pretty stunning. This is slightly out of the bounds of the time period that we talk about, with 1580 being the kind of apex of the Ottoman Empire. But just to give you an idea how much the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire controls, it is very sizable. Not quite the same size as the Roman Empire, but a fairly hefty chunk. And because of this, because of this control of the central and eastern Mediterranean, the Spanish and Portuguese traders who had participated in the Reconquista are really paying through the nose for any kind of luxuries, any kind of exotic materials, whether it's indigo dye, silk, spices, porcelain, these sort of really expensive things, these things that everybody wanted, everybody who was rich wanted, couldn't be gotten except through a very hefty sum through Italian traders, or if you wanted to go directly to the source, or as close to the source as you could probably go to Constantinople. What's the problem with that? Well, in 1480s, 1490s, you're at war with the Muslims, so you're not going to trade with them. And the Italians know you're at war. And so they're going to charge you way more than maybe even your neighbors would pay. So a lot of this presents itself as an obstacle to the Spanish and the Portuguese. And whenever there's an obstacle, people always look for a way around it. And one of the ways around it was through navigation. One of the early sponsors of European navigation is Henry the Navigator. He's a Portuguese prince who was fascinated with exploration and maps. He funded many expeditions to uncover new lands for Portugal and started looking for alternate routes to China. And he kind of sets the trend in Portugal and to a lesser extent in Spain for exploration of the natural world, where the Renaissance is taking place in Italy, and they're talking about innovations in medicine and understanding how the natural world works, science and philosophy. This is looking at geography and real world planning. And so we have the voyages that were initially sponsored by Henry the Navigator begin to map out the coast of Western Africa. In the years after his death, you have continuation of these sponsorships, like Bartolomeo Diaz, who is the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope. He actually finds that the Indian Ocean is connected to the Atlantic Ocean at the tip of Africa, but turns back. It's not until we have Vasco da Gama, who is set out specifically to establish trade with Asia and to look for allies in the fight against Muslims, that he eventually makes it all the way to Calicut, India. Now, Vasco da Gama sails with an armed vessels. He has 3 vessels that he takes with him into the Indian Ocean. Initially, he tried to pass himself off as a Muslim. He even stops off in what would later be known as Great Zimbabwe, or it's actually the remnants of the Great Zimbabwe Empire, where he's chased out because he doesn't know how to speak Arabic. He doesn't know anything about the Quran. And so his claim to be a Muslim is rather kind of paper thin. And so he turns to piracy. He begins to attack vessels, particularly Muslim trading vessels. And he captures them and takes slaves, and he takes cargo. Eventually, he makes landfall in Calicut in 1498, and he lands very arrogantly, and he's looking for allies. He thinks he's found the land of Prester John, a mythological Christian, immortal Christian leader who has this kind of like secret Christian army and has been blessed by God with immortality and infinite wisdom. And he thinks he found it because he sees some of the Hindu temples and he mistakes some of these Hindu temples for being Christian temples, Catholic churches, particularly any that depict female gods. They think of he interprets as depicting the Virgin Mary and that sort of thing. And he also is looking for spices because he's got to pay for this trip. It's got to be self-sustaining. Now, he does trade for peppercorns, and he has a navigator with him that he picked up in Africa. And the navigator said, hey, follow this wind. You're going to have to wait about 6 months before you travel back. Well, Vasco da Gama didn't believe that. He thought God would change the winds for him because he was on a holy mission, right? He was coming back to Portugal. It took him 3 times as long to come back to Africa and to round back through the Cape of Good Hope and back up to Portugal. During that time, he lost 2 of his other ships and 3/4 of his men. So he's coming back with 1 ship loaded with peppercorn and still makes a 300% profit after they take into consideration the loss of the ships and the cargo that they carried and the men that they carried. But that was the last one, because poor people, they don't really count. So he gets a 300% return, and the Portuguese are absolutely excited at the idea of establishing a direct trade route with between Asia and Europe. And so he's sent back to try to conquer the Indian subcontinent for Portugal. He's driven out by the Mughal army, the Muslim Mughal army, but he does establish a small port town called Goa. And interestingly enough, Goa remains a Portuguese holding until 1979. He does establish this kind of trade route and begins kind of committing acts of piracy by demanding people have licenses to trade on the Indian Ocean. If they don't have licenses, he sinks their ships. This is a very, very peculiar and abrupt change because piracy in the Indian Ocean was really kind of almost non-existent. It was very rarely encountered in this part of the Indian Ocean. Now, when you get into the South China Sea, yeah, it happened a lot more often. But in this part of the Indian Ocean, it was considered relatively safe. So his interjection of piracy into the Indian Ocean was a kind of a game changer, if you will. And Portugal begins to push on, not content with just trading with India, they push on to China. And eventually, even though this is going to be a little bit outside of our range and our scope, the Portuguese arrive in China in 1514. But they act arrogantly there as well, and they're offensive in their smell, their body smell, as well as their actions. They act barbarously, and they're pushed out by the Chinese, and they don't come back for another generation for about 40 years. When they do come back, they're allowed to set up one trading post in one town, and they have to pay tribute every year. They have to pay basically kind of a cover charge to be in that trading port. And they push even further on, and by 1542 they've arrived in Japan, and they've learned some of the lessons that that their predecessors had to learn the hard way in India and China. And they show up with a trade deputation and with missionaries. And they begin to learn Japanese customs, and they begin to learn Japanese language, and they begin to dress and bathe and eat in the manner that the Japanese did. They kowtow to the shogun, which means to bow all the way down to the floor. They show meekness in the eyes of the samurai. They don't try to tick off the samurai because they know they will be killed. And they secretly start to begin to spread Christianity. So that leaves us on the cusp of the age of exploration. The Italian city-states have spawned the Renaissance, and imitators begin to pick up in France, England, Germany, throughout Europe, well into the 17th century. The Muslims are in control of the western terminus of the Silk Road and all those traditional trade routes, which then prompts the Portuguese and the Spanish to begin to explore west and south. Our European understanding of the world increases through a separation of science from superstition, misunderstanding, and misinformation. For example, the Galileo and his um, his theory of how the solar system is put together was put to the test. In fact, he was put on trial for saying that the sun was the center of our solar system and that our solar system wasn't even the center of the universe. He was made to retract that statement because it contradicted what was in the Bible, even though scientifically he could prove that it was true, that his version was true and the Bible's version was wrong. Nation states begin to form. England, France, and Spain are emerging, and their identity is beginning to emerge, but it's not quite solidified yet. Much like the Italian city-states, they all recognize themselves as kind of Italian, but they recognize themselves as Genoese first, or Florentine first, or Venetian first, and only Italian secondary. And as often as not, they're fighting against each other. So you don't have that kind of sense that we are Italians per se, even though they speak the same language and have similar cultures. All right, that is it for this week. Remember, the analysis of the Inferno is due Sunday in the Inferno Dropbox. There are some articulations for the instructions. Remember that we're looking at, you want to compare who Dante Alighieri meets in the first circle of hell versus the people he meets or maybe sees in the other circles of hell. Give me an idea of who is he critiquing and why is he critiquing this? Is it effective? I also have some more instructions in the overview for this week, as well as in the Dropbox itself. Okay, and if you've already contacted me about extra credit and it's almost ready, remember that you have to submit it by Friday, not Sunday, Friday, this Friday. Okay, that's it for this week. I hope you guys have a great week and see you again next week.